Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 15. And today I'm joined by Jason Bock and we are going to be chatting about C#9 source generators, which should be very interesting with this being an audio-only podcast, but we can all but try. So welcome to the show, Jason.
We will try. Yes, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
So you actually joined us last month for a talk at .NET Oxford about source generators, which was both extremely awesome and also extremely useful for me, giving me some context of source generators, because I hadn't really had much chance to play around with it before this recording. Although I did actually have a play around this morning and created a little Hello World source generator. But before we get into source generators, at the start of each episode, I'm going to start off by reading a social media mention from our listeners. And this episode's mention is from Nick Kirby, where he said in a tweet, I built a tool that sends me notifications when podcast episodes become available with Azure Functions and Azure Storage, queues and tables. The podcasts I've subscribed myself to are Unhandled Exception Podcast, and he's put hashtag Unhandled Exception, which is the hashtag I tend to use, Signals Threads, I think that's Signal and Threads podcast, and Moonpig Tech podcasts. So that sounds pretty cool. Not sure if this tool is publicly available, but I'll ping him and ask him. And if it is, I'll include that in the show notes. And it's an honor to be included in that list. So I've not actually given you a proper formal intro, Jason. So Jason is a developer advocate at Quicken Loans, author, speaker, and C# Microsoft MVP. Hopefully I've got that right, Jason. That was relying on your LinkedIn profile being up to date there.
Yep, that is correct. It's a new job for me. I actually just joined them about 9-10 months ago, so almost a year ago. And before that, I'd been working at a consulting company for about 20 years. And for pretty much my whole career, 23 years, I've been working at consulting companies. So I've had a mindset to some degree about how I approach work and what that entails and what you do. And this is somewhat of a departure from that, but it's also really aligns well with what I like to do with a lot of things that you typically do in a DevRel role. So yeah, I'm really enjoying it right now.
Nice. And I think before we started recording, we were chatting a bit about public speaking and removing ums and ahs, which I still need to get better at. But I'm so impressed with all your talks where at .NET Oxford, like there was no ums or ahs at all.
And now you're going to make, even though you can edit it out, I'm going to be conscious of it, that you said it. It's one thing, and we were talking about this before, and when we were talking about recording this, about having tips. And I've got a couple later that I'll mention, but since we're on the topic, the tip of many tips I can give people about how do you improve public speaking skills and what can you do when you're getting on stage, related to this is, and it's going to sound trite, but it's so true, is practice your talks. At least practice them 3 times. Record yourself if you can. If you're in a room, it may feel silly, but act like you're talking to a room. Act it out and record yourself. You will be amazed the first time you do it at your mannerisms, how you speak, the gestures that you do, I'm not really. So you can't edit those out because that was deliberate. it's one of those things that you just like anything in life, if you want to get really good at it, if you want it to be something that's very fluid and feels natural, whether it's, playing music, I got all my instruments over here, Dan can see where I'm waving, but this is a podcast, so this is all like you have to visualize this in your head that I'm talking about the room I'm in right now. My office, I have a bunch of instruments, and I've been playing music for many years. I didn't just pick up a guitar and was able to play Eruption by Van Halen right out of the gate. I had to practice and make many mistakes. And so that's one of the things, if you want to do public speaking, to eliminate some of those things and get better at that craft, is just practice and record yourself. So that's one of the tips I got.
Well, it's really interesting with developers and instruments. So I've got I've got a guitar over there. I've got a guitar in the other room. And I think, which one was it? It was the DDD episode we did. I can't remember what number it was. And that was a group episode, so there was quite a few of us. And at the end, we just noticed that we all had instruments in the background. it wasn't in person, so we just took a screenshot, but we all can see each other. So we got a screenshot with us all with our instruments out.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
I'll include a link to that in the show notes.
And if we want to do that for this one, I can grab one of mine at the end and we'll take a shot of that if you want.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
I'll find I've got one in that room and then I've got electric over there, but that sounds good.
All right. Sounds good.
It sounds from what you were saying about Van Halen that you're probably a bit more advanced than I am, though.
It's funny. There's, people that I've seen that play guitar that are just beginning and they've been making some of the, the beginner mistakes, just like I did when I was learning. And at this point, on the one hand, I feel like I can go on stage and start soloing and start playing and do what is, and play off of what other people are doing on stage. But then there are people that I know that I'm in awe of because they're so good at what they do, and it's amazing to watch them. So it's all relative. Even people that are really, really good professional players, they're the good ones are the ones that are humble because they'll say, "Oh, I'm still learning from this person," or "I just heard this person playing, and wow, that was really cool. That was interesting." And those are the musicians I want to learn from because they are still learning, even if they've been doing it professionally for years.
Definitely. Just touching on your point about practicing as well with public speaking, one thing, obviously not at the moment because we don't commute, but one thing I used to do a lot is in the car whilst I was commuting to the office, just practicing my talks. And quite often that's how I would discover the content, by just talking out loud. And also that when you're driving, you're not worried about someone overhearing in another room, so you've not got that self-consciousness, and you can just talk out loud, practice as you're driving.
Yeah.
And it's like killing two birds with one stone as well, because it's using that time while you're commuting.
Yep. I've done that a lot. If I'm driving somewhere, I will just be practicing a talk in my head, although you don't want to get too into it because you are driving. And if I was doing that where you live, I think I'd really need to be concentrating because I'm so used to driving on the right side of the road. And where you live, y'all drive on the left side of the road, and I would be so confused. I don't think that would be a good idea for me. I'd really have to be focusing hard. But yeah, I do that a lot in the cars. I practice talks. So
that's true. I shouldn't really recommend that people get distracted whilst driving on this show, really. So I'll take that back. Cool. Okay, source generators then. So I know the name kind of gives us a clue, but what are source generators?
So source generators, it's a new feature that's in C# 9. Technically, it's a feature in the compiler that so happens to match with C# 9. And I make that distinction because when you think of a language feature that comes in C#, it's typically a new keyword. It's a new way, like to do, instead of switch statements, you can do pattern matching. It's something like that. This isn't a new keyword or a new syntax or anything like that. It's you create a project that references the proper NuGet packages from Microsoft, the Microsoft code analysis ones. And then you implement some interfaces, and you essentially are just saying, I want to generate more C# code during compilation. And I just kind of did the air quotes when I said that, because the compilation phase, if you think of running the actual compiler, CSC, which you can do from the command line, though most people are using tools like Visual Studio, VS Code, Writer, whatever the case may be. So you may be running .NET Build or .NET Run or CSC, or you may just be using a tool. But the point is the underlying compiler has a way for you to say, oh, by the way, reference these assemblies, and they're going to be source generator assemblies. So they're going to be part of the compilation process. But they also run as you are typing in an IDE like Visual Studio. And the IDE will occasionally ask your source compiler, hey, do you want to do anything else now? Because things have changed. So, but it's part of that compilation pipeline. That's where these really come into play. And so they can generate C# code by just simply emitting it, like having a string that has C# code in it. Like what we were talking about before we started is you can do like a hello world example that just has nothing but a class that has a method that's going to put on the console write line, hello world. And then you can call that from your project to say, this class is now generated, I'm going to use it, and I can call hello world. That's pretty simple. You can also look at things like what's the existing syntax tree that's going on from the compilation, and then react to what you see in there. And that starts getting a lot more complicated. You can also read additional files. You can also, if you really want to, you could go call a service or a database or something like that. But however you start, the end result is new code. It's new code that does something that's going to make your life easier. So that's kind of source generators in a nutshell, but we can unpack and dive deeper as we go on.
With this being an audio podcast, I know in your talk you give quite a complicated example because we could see code. But for the audio podcast, what would be the smallest, simplest, this hello world example? What would that actually look like to a developer?
Well, the hello world example, the simplest way to explain this is if you're going to create a source generator and you wanted to just emit some C# code, there's an interface that you'll implement, and there's a couple of methods on there. And in fact, I've got Visual Studio up, even though I know people can't see what I'm doing here, but it's just for reference purposes for my own sanity. If you look at the actual interface that you're going to be implementing, which is called iSource Generator. And again, even though this is a podcast, for people that get interested in this, there's already a lot of examples and a lot of references you can go look at and see the details visually. But this interface is basically your hook, along with you have to have a generator attribute on your class. But this basically says, hey, when execute is called, that's where I'm going to use this context that's given to me. And this context has a method on it called add source. And so I can just say, hey, here's my source. Here's the source that has text in it that's a C# class that has a method on it that's going to emit that hello world to the console. You can do something as simple as that. So that's kind of the 101 of generators. The reason why you want to do this is that there's a whole bunch of reasons, a whole bunch of examples as to why you'd want to write a source generator. So maybe that's kind of the path I should go down with this answer, is kind of getting into, what's the motivation, or what's the reason why I'd want to spend the time to learn about syntax trees and semantic models and all this other good stuff. And I mentioned this in the talk, is there's two reasons I think why you'd want to use a source generator, which is performance and simplicity. The simplicity part is you can think of the example of iNotify property change. That's one that I think a lot of C# developers have run into. If you need to implement that interface, it's not hard. It's fairly straightforward, but it's boilerplate, it's repetitive, it's boring. It's not that much fun to have to implement this. And yet you need to if you want to have an object that's observable with its state, specifically with state changes.
I remember that when doing WPF stuff, and it's just so much code when, as you say, it's just boilerplate code.
Yep, exactly. And one of the examples that the C# team has with source generators is a way to just attribute a field, and that will trigger a source generation to basically do all the code for iNotify property change for you. So that eliminates something that you need to do. It's something that it's repetitive, it's algorithmic, and it's not the fun stuff that a developer really wants to do. So that's one of them. Another one is implementing equatable or equality on your object. That's fairly straightforward, and you can do that as a source generator as well. So it's that simplicity aspect. I can take what I know I need to write, and if I can figure out in my head a path of saying I need to do these steps all the time, you could write a source generator that just does it for you. So that makes it automated and simplistic. The other one is performance. One of the examples that I do when I do my talk is showing a way to do object mapping with a source generator. So I have a source object that has X amount of properties and a destination object that has Y amount of properties. And there's a bunch of those that match. They have the same names, the same types. And you want to create an instance of the destination, but you want to set all their properties to ones that are from the source. This is, I bring the example in of AutoMapper. That's one that a lot of people as .NET developers know of. And that's a great library, and it's been optimized a lot. But it has to use at some point reflection, expression trees, other techniques to kind of figure out on the fly, what are those mappings? What are those things between these two objects that I can match and then do a set? What's accessible from one to the other, and on and on. And as much as you can optimize that, you still have to do some kind of reflection. You have to do something at runtime to do this. Whereas if you use a source generator, you can look at the source type and the destination type, and through these syntax trees and semantic models, discover what are the matches. And once you do that, you can then emit some C# code that says, oh, I want to create a new destination type and set these properties accordingly. But it's all in C# code. So it's about as optimized as you're ever going to get it. It's part of your compilation, and it's going to be about as fast as anything I could think of if you want to do mapping. So if you're doing a reflection code, that to me is one of the tips I give people is, if you're thinking about writing a source generator, look at the code that you're writing and see if you've done anything with reflection. That doesn't mean you can get rid of it and make it a source generator, but it's potentially a good candidate to look at and say, could I make this something that instead of doing with reflection, I can do with a source generator and get potentially a boost in performance.
So does this remove the need for tools like PostSharp and Fody and this kind of thing, or does this extend it, and do they fit together?
Do they fit together? I'm not sure if they fit, though it's interesting because I saw about a month or so ago that PostSharp made an announcement that they're completely changing, rewriting everything they do and making it such that they're actually using a forked version of the Roslyn compiler. And so their engine is going to be completely Roslyn. It's not necessarily source generator based, but it's going to be much simpler and easier to use is the way that's the reaction I got from that tool. I'll take your question and kind of answer it in a slightly different way maybe, which is if you look at tools like PostSharp or Fody, you can add code, you can add implementation, you can also edit it. You can change things. Like if you want to weave in, the typical idea is aspect-oriented programming. I have somewhere when I log, when I enter a method and I exit a method. You can use these tools to do that. With source generators, they just create new code. You can't modify what's currently there with source generators. And I've been an MVP for, I'm looking behind me now, way too long. I was looking at my award behind me, and I think I've been in the program now for 14 years or something like that. And even with C# being open source now, it wasn't in the past. It had that very closed source, and if you were an MVP, that's where you could kind of get the curtain pulled and you could see behind the stage and what's really going on. And the discussion about code modification, metaprogramming, those types of concepts has been around. It's nothing new. It's been around a while in the C# world, in the community. And there was an attempt, I'm thinking of the GIF meme where there's this like star flying by that says there was an attempt to do this in C#. And it actually happened near the time where it was becoming open source. I think you can still find the pull requests and some of the work that was done in the past. So this isn't like NDA or anything like that. They talk about adding these keywords like replace and original and doing this and making partial classes even much more of a thing so that you could potentially do something like that. But they backed away from it because it got really confusing for people when you're trying to say, I'm writing this code, and then all of a sudden it's going to change on you. And how do you manage that? How do you debug it? How do you do all these things for a typical developer to reason about in an effective way? Long story short, they kind of said this is probably a little bit too adventurous and too much. went back to the drawing board and came up with this idea of source generators, which is still powerful, even if you can't edit your source code, which I personally would like to do. Small plug, I co-authored a book on metaprogramming in .NET, so I would love to do these things. But that's not to take away from the concept of source generators, because there's a lot of cool things that people are already doing with source generators to enable certain scenarios. So with your question of, does this complement or work with Fody and PostSharper tools that actually let you do modification? Yes, air quotes, yes, in that the source generated code you create, it's part of your assembly. If you use a tool like ILSpy, you'll just see it in there just like any other code. It's no different. So you could, in theory, be able to then use something like Fody to take that result in assembly and then do a whole bunch of other things if you want. So they don't like contradict or prevent one or the other from working. They just take the problem and approach it in different ways.
It's just a different stage in the pipeline. I can imagine if you could start editing code in source generators, that can bring in a whole other world of problems, I guess.
Yeah, it can make a lot of different issues come up. And also just from an IDE experience, if you are typing in code and then as you pause for a second, all of a sudden it just changes on you. And you're like, where did that come from? Why did this just happen? And again, in some ways, I would love that. I would have no problem with that. But I can definitely see where that would be quite a leap for a lot of people, especially if they haven't been used to that at all, to suddenly go, wow, what is this doing? What about debugging? What about edit continue? So it's something that the team right now has been pretty adamant about in a positive way, and saying when they get asked, well, are we ever going to be able to in the future with source generators do like editing code? And they said, yeah, that's not going to happen. There's things that they may do in the future, and we can talk about some things they've already stated that they're looking at for like a version 2 or in the future of source generators. But that's one that they said, yeah, that's a challenge, and that's really not anywhere close on our radar right now.
So they're basically doing open close principle for source generators.
Essentially, yeah. And some people get, it's funny. Sometimes I see people that get upset in comments like, well, why can't I do this? I really like to do this. But again, that doesn't take away from the things that you can do with it. If it's one of those things I try to have in my head all the time. It's not what I can't do. It's what can I do? And with source generators, a lot of things you can do to solve problems in your domain. And like I talk about the simplicity aspect, take some of those things away and make them easier, so then you don't even have to think about them anymore.
Touching on what you mentioned earlier about everything being open source and in the open, I guess the Microsoft team have got a lot more comments coming in as they're thinking things through and doing plannings and doing the initial proof of concepts.
Yeah.
And they can't please everyone.
Oh, yeah. I admire the team at Microsoft from the perspective of they went from a closed source model, which I've heard in some interviews that they always wanted to and had the intention of at some point make it open source. It's just, we all know the history of Microsoft with open source. It wasn't a pretty one for quite a long time. And slowly, I did actually a talk on the state of open source and .NET a couple of years ago. So I was looking through this history, and you can see even like in the early 2000s, there were projects that they were releasing in open source. It was just kind of a trickle, just a little bit here and there, but it slowly but surely over time started to get more and more, to the point where in 2014, they said they were going to open source Roslyn, which was quite a nice shock to me. I was very happy that they did that. And that just, to me, seemed to open the floodgates where everything just started becoming open source. But you take this team, we've had people on it for quite a long time, and they've all been working in a particular model in a particular way. And now all of a sudden you can have anybody in the world coming in and saying, here's a pull request, or here's a feature, or here's an issue, or you idiots, why are you not doing this? Some people don't necessarily have the tact that they should. And it could be quite frustrating, I imagine, but they seem to have adjusted really, really well and kind of are learning just like anybody does in open source. What do you respond to? How do you handle contributions? How do you do all this stuff well with a code base that literally everybody in .NET runs? Everybody runs a compiler. So, it's in some ways quite a feat to see what they do. And being an open source, you're right. You get a lot more of an ability to get opinions from everybody. Now, that's a two-edged sword. That can also be quite overwhelming, but there are things that people can sometimes say, hey, did you think about this? And that may lead to other thoughts and conversations that could be somewhat beneficial in the future. So
I would love to have a podcast episode, speaking to one of the people in charge of open source for .NET.
Make it happen. Make it happen, because that'd be cool. Yeah.
It'd be really interesting because there must be so many problems that you just don't think about, which they've hit, and maybe they didn't think about it until they hit those problems. But it'd be a really interesting conversation.
I would, honestly, you just hit on something here. I think you should, because I can see on your wall behind you, you got the MVP program too. Just email somebody like Mads and just say, it may not be you, but is there somebody within the team? I do a podcast and I'd love to have this conversation. I bet they'll find somebody and you're going to have a great episode if you do. And I would listen to that.
Right. I will send that email after we finish recording.
Yeah.
Nice. So when you were doing your demo and looking at the different bits of code, the actual code, and we touched on this earlier as well, the code that was writing the generated source pretty much looked like a list of write lines where you're writing literal strings.
Yes.
And you did mention that that's one way of doing it, but there's also a NuGet package that supports templating. So there's different ways of doing this.
Yeah. So the package you're talking about is one called Scribian, and it's github.com/Scribian/Scribian. I have not used it, so I've not spent the time to just kind of dive in and do like a quick tutorial on it or how it works. But from what I've been able to see, it looks very interesting, especially if you're trying to do something like a source generator, because it has a template feel to it. And so then you can kind of fill in the holes where you need to put in certain things in your code. But you're right. The technique I've done is I use a text writer, ironically one from the code DOM, which is called indented text writer. So then the result looks, somewhat pretty and nice. And it's works, it's doable, but I'll be honest, it also kind of sucks because I'm trying to write C# code in C# code using strings. And that's not a fun world to be in. Scribian could make it easier in some ways, I believe. So that's another technique to use. However you do it, you can actually build a syntax tree if you really want using the Roslyn APIs. And say, I want to add in an invocation expression. I want to make a type declaration. I want to do this and build up your whole tree and then basically do a toString on it. And that's my source text. So there's a couple of ways you can end up doing this. Quite frankly, none of them are maybe Scribian, but Scribian, I think, is kind of getting closer to what we would want. But to me, it's this problem of I need to create a string of C# text. And right now, the C# language doesn't have a great way to let you really do that without stumbling all over the place with escaped characters that don't work well within a string. So this leads to potentially a feature that might be added to C#. And again, this is all open source, so it's nothing hidden. But one idea that they've been talking about is called raw string literals. So you can essentially put and I'm not sure if this is exactly the way it's going to work, but you can do like quote, 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 and then everything after that is just a string. And then at the end, you'd have quote, quote, quote. And the point of this is that you essentially have a way to say this is just a bunch of text. But the way I say that this is a raw string, I can kind of use some type of syntax delimiter that it doesn't force me to think about how do I escape all these special characters within the string. So this would be useful for JSON or XML or a whole bunch of other things. That may be something that helps out in an odd sort of way with source generators, because when I've been trying to test them too, if I write unit tests, everybody shared there's another tip, write your unit tests. But when I'm writing my tests for source generators, it kind of sucks because there's this code that I need to have go through the pipeline of the compilation process. But to do that, I kind of stumble a little bit because I have to do all this escaping at times. There needs to be a better way to do this. And so maybe raw strings or raw literal strings will be a help in a way to do this. But again, Scribian is something that other people can take a look at. I think some people that have written some source generators use that as well and seem to like it. So as long as you're creating a string at the end of the day, that's really how you get to that point. It doesn't matter.
That sounds really nice, the raw strings. I think obviously you've got the @ sign, which you can do multiple line string literals, but you've still got to escape them, as you say. And quite often, like you mentioned about unit tests or integration tests, I want to put a bit of JSON in there because I want to test against that JSON and just not having to go through escaping it all. That'd be so nice.
Yeah, I have run in exactly what you're talking about. I've run into cases, I'm just like scrolling through the code I have right now, but I know I've seen cases where I'm trying to have C# code within a string, and then I run into a case where I have to omit in my C# code a interpolated string within it, and it's just like it just fries my brain at times, like where I am and what I'm doing, and it's like, ugh, just ugly. It's not fun at all. So yeah, I'm hoping that actually gets in because it's not source generator specific, but would help out a bit in that area.
Nice. So whilst you mentioned about unit tests, can you test these source generators?
Yeah, you can. And people ask me at times, like, what are some things that people should do as developers, especially if you're starting out, and get in the habit of doing? To me, it's unit tests. There are others, but that's one that people should get in the habit of, is no matter what kind of code you're writing for what purpose, get tests in play, because they've saved me so many times. And I can tell a story. I won't right now, but there was a story I had in the past where I was kind of against unit testing. I thought it was a waste of time. And then one day I got a revelation. And literally ever since then, I have been championing unit tests. So even in something like source generators, can you do unit tests? Absolutely. When you create a source generator, I don't think there's a source generator template. There is one for analyzers, but there's examples already out there from the Microsoft team that show not only how you can create a source generator, but how you can also build tests as well. I've been playing with and using the compiler API for a long time. Like I remember way back in the PDC days where Anders Hausberg, which I hope I said the name right, would give a little bit of a hint as this compiler as a service thing they've been working on. And slowly but surely over time, you'd hear about compiler as a service, Project Roslyn, and what it was and what it was going to do. And I was watching this intently. And as soon as there were beta bits that you could start playing with, I think that was like 2011, I was downloading it and trying it. So I've been working with the compiler API as an outsider for many years. And so the point of why I bring this up is because you can definitely drive the compilation process in C# code. So you can create compilations, you can omit code, you can do things where you use something like what's called a C# generator driver. And that actually will allow you to say, oh, I've got a compilation. I want these generators to look at the compilation, and then I can pull out the results to see, were there any diagnostics that were reported? Did it actually create new source text and so on? And then you can just write tests or tests to look at those results and do your assertions accordingly. So yeah, you can absolutely write tests against your source generators. It's not simple. I'm not going to sit here and claim that it's easy to do per se, especially if you're not familiar with source generators and the compiler API, but it's definitely doable. You can do it, and you should.
Just thinking out loud, can you write source generators to help write your tests? I'm presuming there would be some use cases where that might... I'm going very meta here, but I was
yeah.
Would you test those then as well?
So could you write a source generator to write your tests? There's no reason why you couldn't. There was a project that I remember a long time ago. I did some talks on it called PEX.
Ah, yes, I've heard of that.
Okay. So PEX is this tool. It actually ended up getting morphed into what's called IntelliTest. So if you have Visual Studio Enterprise version, which everybody does, of course, because it's so cheap. No sarcasm. It's a tool with, I think it's non-professional. It's only an enterprise, but it's what PEX originally was. And what it does is it looks at your code, your public API, and says, if I call this method with these values, what is the expected result? It basically looks into your method and determines all paths and the boundary conditions and automatically generates tests to say, well, I know that if I do this condition, these are going to be the results. So it's going to generate unit tests for you for those cases. Now, some people hear that and go, ooh, I never have to write a unit test. I could just have this thing write all my tests for me. But it has no intelligence in terms of, is the code that you've written in the first place correct? It has no idea about that. It's just reacting to what's there. So sure, it can create a bunch of tests, and it might actually come up with some cases that you didn't think about, which is where I think the power of something like that is, in that I didn't think of this condition, and it found it, and ooh, now I should go back in my real unit test suite and put it in there. But it can't determine that the logic you've written is correct. So that's a tool that writes tests based on your code. There's no reason why you couldn't do something like that with a source generator. Have it look at your code and say, oh, here's a type and here are the methods, and dive into a whole syntax tree. This wouldn't be easy, but you could do it. And say, well, I want to write a test to call this method, and then have it generate your X unit or N unit, whatever it is, all these tests, and then actually have those be run. I would love to see that done by somebody. I'm kind of thinking, how would you do that? But I also know I don't have any time to do that. but hopefully somebody gets inspired to do that, because I think that'd be pretty cool to look at.
Have I just given you your next project? I know you've got this Rocks and various other projects.
I'm always thinking of things.
The listeners can't see your face now, but you're looking so tempted right now.
Yeah, I really don't want to get nerd sniped right now. I really don't. But there's a part of me that's going, man, this would be kind of interesting. But I've got a whole list of other things I'd love to do. Maybe I'll just put it on the never-ending to-do list and get around to it eventually. But in case I don't, if other people get inspired out there, give it a whirl, give it a shot. In theory, definitely yes. To answer your question, I don't see any reason why you couldn't do that. It's how far do you want to go with something like that? That's where the real question comes in.
Speaking of funky things you can do with tests, and just whilst you mentioned PEX, I saw a lightning talk, was it last year or early this year? And actually, the guy that did the lightning talk, I was planning to get in touch to see if he was up for doing an episode on it. So I've not asked him yet, so I don't know whether he's listening, but I'll get in touch with him soon. But on something he called mutation testing. I don't know whether you've heard of that.
I've heard of it, but that's about as much as I've gone into it. I really haven't. I think I've tried to read a couple of articles or look at a couple of tools that do that, but it hasn't clicked in my head yet. So unfortunately, I'm not the person to get a good opinion on it. But that's sometimes things just take time. This reminds me of the first time somebody introduced me to, because you'd mentioned Rocks, this mocking library that I've created, which is now all source generator based. So yay. But you mentioned Rocks. So way back, I think in when was this? 2007, somewhere around that timeline. There was a project I was on where somebody said, hey, we should start using mocks for unit tests. And I went, what are those? I really never heard of this. And so he put together a quick demo on something they use Rhino mocks. And I ran away screaming because Rhino mocks just looked to me to be so painful and so confusing. And I'm like, why would we do this? This looks like it, my initial reaction was just, ugh. I just didn't want to do that at all. It didn't, the benefit and the help didn't seem to be there in any way, shape, or form. But sometime later, I don't know, a year or two or whatever later, there were other libraries that came out, like in Substitute, MOQ, which their APIs were much easier to use, much better. And for some reason, that is what clicked in my head. And I went, oh, now I get it. Now I may, especially with End Substitute, that was really the one that I went, that one makes a lot of sense to me. So then I started understanding, and the whole thing about mocks and they can be abused and people shouldn't use them in tests. I get that argument as well. But the concept didn't really click until a certain thing happened. And then the switch went off in my head and then I got it. And at some point with like mutation testing, I think I'd have to just find the right article or something where it's explained in a certain way where it starts making a lot of sense to me. So
I should probably explain what mutation testing is then. Not too much, because if he joins me for an episode on it, we can go into more detail. But from my understanding, the library or the mutation testing library using randomly in memory changes the production code, just makes random changes. So if you've got an if statement, like if something is equal to something else, it might change it to not equals, or just randomly change stuff. And for each change, it will see if any of your tests fail. And if a test fails, that's a good thing. So you move on to the next mutation. I think that's how he described it.
Oh, okay. Because I think you just sort of flipped the switch in my head, because that was something that was bothering me. Like, why would I want a tool to just randomly change my code? Because it's written in a way that I want it to be. So why would I do that? But yeah, you're trying to make sure that your tests are actually it's catching the right things, correct?
Yes, it's making sure that your code has tests against it that's covering all your changes.
Okay.
If in your production code, if you accidentally changed equals to not equals, or you made some change, say you've got not something and you accidentally delete the not, then a test should fail catching that.
A test should fail, yeah. Okay, see, today I learned something. And you just, now I got another thing on my list. Thank you.
I'm glad I explained it enough that you could understand it.
I don't know why I think the thing that I was struggling with is, why would I have this thing that would just randomly change my code to see if it fails or not? I don't know why that just never clicked in my head, but you want to make sure that your tests are actually covering your implementation in a way that you expect, and that if it changes, it should fail. So, okay, now I'm all on board. See, now you got at least more podcasts you got to pursue, because those would be really interesting to listen to.
And the guy that did the lightning talk, I can't remember his name, but in fact, I think it was recorded, so I can include a link to that lightning talk in the show notes.
Oh, nice.
But as I say, he doesn't know yet, but he's been on my list for a while to actually get in touch with and do this episode, because I think it was just such a really interesting concept I hadn't heard about before. Mm-hmm. But I've already got something that can break my production code. It's called me.
Yeah, you need somebody to mutate tests. I'll do it. I do it all the time, so why do I need a tool to make, things bad? So I'm the tool. So I always speaking of source generators, I always love that you'd see in the past, like from T4 or other tools, where you'd sometimes see this code was generated by a tool, and I would just smirk a little bit, so because it was literally true, but it also had that kind of dig in there as well. So.
It's funny, before you said that, when you mentioned about it was generated by a tool, I was just thinking the same, and then you almost read my mind.
Nice.
Great minds think alike.
Yeah.
Daft ones seldom differ.
Oh, I like that one. I really do.
So we've spoken a bit about the compiler API and expression trees and semantic models. Do you reckon we can... I know it's difficult in a podcast. Do you reckon we can dig a bit deeper and explain what those things are?
So expression tree. Okay, so you said expression trees, syntax trees, semantic models. I'll even throw in reflection in there, because some people always put that in there as well. And you could even go another level to some degree too, which is, what about tools like MonoCecil that allow me to actually load an assembly and read its contents at an IL level? So, it's all these things that, and some of them are related to source generators, especially syntax trees and semantic models. But there's all these different things in C# that allow me to kind of look at code as data in a way. That when I write my C# code and I'm just typing in public class customer, blah, 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 that at some point that's turned into what is known as a syntax tree. So I'm going to throw in this here real quick in that my degrees, which are actually right behind me, are in electrical engineering. I'm not taught as a computer science person, which doesn't stop anybody, But the point is, I never took a compilation, like a compiler course when I went to university or anything like that. I kind of learned these things as I grew in my career. So, with compilers, you have where you parse tokens and blah blah blah. But with source generators, what you typically start with are syntax trees and the components of a syntax tree. Like, do you have a syntax node? Do you have a token? You can also use trivia. That's your white space, comments, stuff like that. These are all things that just completely represent your code as a string, except it puts it into a tree. So that's nice. You have all this information there, but sometimes you need a little bit more. So, like, I can find out that I had a type declaration syntax node, which will define either a class or a struct or a record now, because records are in C#9. So I have that. That's great. But what are its base types? What other types does it implement? What are some of the other things or aspects about a particular node that trying to figure that out from a syntax level is quite difficult, to say the least. So in the API, there's like another level called the semantic model. And a lot of people use these because it makes it easier to figure out, okay, I've got this node, but I want more rich information. So I get a symbol, essentially, that represents that node. So I can get like a type symbol or a method symbol or an event symbol. And it kind of feels almost like reflection, even though it's not. I want to be clear, it's not. But it has sort of that feel or flavor to what you're trying to do. And that semantic model literally just gives you more semantic information about the node. So that's kind of the next level. Now, if you start throwing in things like expression trees, well, expression trees have been around since, when were they added? Was it C#3 or 5? I'm forgetting off the top of my head. Maybe 4. I'm not sure, but they've been around for a while. And essentially, it's a way for you just to say, in a syntax that you typically use for lambda expressions, except that it's not an actual function. It's an expression of a function. It's a way with a tree in and of itself to say, well, this function has all these other nodes. Now, the funny thing is that that's not related to the compiler API at all. It's a different kind of model. And in fact, this has lent itself to some tension because the expression trees you have in C#, they don't have the same representation as like a syntax tree in the compiler API. And this can get down a whole, path of weeds and thorns that I don't think we have the time to get into right now. But, the expression trees do have that kind of same feel as a syntax tree in that you can kind of visit an expression tree and get the same information out of what's in that tree. And then you can compile it and run it. So you can build all these dynamic methods at runtime if you want to. But they're not the same thing as the trees you see in the compiler API. So there's all these different APIs and things that you can look at, especially when you're in source generation, to see what is it that I'm trying to find, and then react to that and build your stuff accordingly based on what's there. And so those are the two things, especially if we're talking about source generators, syntax trees and semantic models. Those are the things you really are going to be learning about and dealing with a lot. So the more you can get your head around those, the better off you're going to be when you're writing your source generators.
I think when I said expression tree, I actually meant syntax tree, but never mind.
Well, it led to more content, so, but it is sometimes, like, I think when I did the talk at .NET Oxford, I think somebody asked about reflection because that's a model of your code, except it's at runtime. So I want to get a type, I want to get all of its methods, I want to get all of its properties, but that's stuff that's already baked. That's stuff that's already there. And it's a model of your code, of your assembly at runtime, whereas this stuff is all at compilation time. So I think somebody asked, could you kind of have an API that has some type of adapter, however you want to view it between the two? And I was like, you really can't, because they're two different worlds. You can use reflection if you want in your generation, in your source generator, but that doesn't serve the same purpose as actually creating that code and looking at the syntax trees. So
You also mentioned something in Visual Studio called the Syntax Visualizer, which looked extremely helpful.
yes, there are a couple of tools that I've used when I've been building not just source generators, but analyzers, refactorings, code fixes, what have you, because it's all in the compiler API world. And in Visual Studio, there's a tool called the Syntax Visualizer, which you need to install the .NET Compiler Platform SDK. I think in the installer, that's the thing you're looking for. But if you install that, then you're going to get a window that you can bring up called the Syntax Visualizer. And if you bring that up and then click over in your code editor, you'll suddenly see the whole syntax tree visually. And that's even as much as I've used stuff in the compiler API, I still use this all the time because I think of an analyzer or generator I want to write, and I start thinking of, okay, what am I looking for? What are the conditions I need to be aware of and I'm going to run into? So I'll literally just start typing C# code and then click on one of those things and then go look over in the visualizer window, and it tells me, oh, this is the particular node type that this is, and here are all of its properties. So if you're using Visual Studio, that's definitely, and you want to write generators or analyzers, you definitely want to have that installed. It's such a time saver. There are some other tools online that people have written to help you figure out, like, how do I generate a new syntax tree using nothing but the compiler API. It will actually generate the whole, like all the syntax factory classes and calls that you need to do. So those are helpful as well, but that one is really nice. Now, if you're using something like VS Code or Writer, I'm not sure, I'm not aware of they have anything similar to what that is. But if there are, you definitely want to find them and use them, because I can't keep that whole API in my head. It's so huge. There's so much to it. So yeah, definitely use that one.
I don't know about VS Code. I'm actually a Rider user, and this morning I Googled that, and it looks like there isn't one. I know there's not user voice. I'm not sure what tool they use for feedback, but there's quite a few people asking for it now, especially with source generators now. But it'd be nice if that's in there.
Yeah.
I think I did see there was an extension for it, but there was no one had started or anything, so I don't know whether it's just someone started it, or whether it's, so I didn't end up giving it a go.
Well, there's another project. I was just wondering, if Rider has an extensibility model, then couldn't somebody just write? Yeah, because it's just that simple. Just write an extension. How hard can that be? Probably very hard, or at least not simple. But yeah, I mean, if the community and somebody that that uses Rider just goes, "Hey, this isn't here," that's how a lot of projects get started. X isn't there,
When do you reckon you can have this done for, Jason?
I and I'm going to say this, and I don't mean anything negative about it. I just don't use Rider, but that's nothing against Rider at all. And I know there's probably people that can be out there going, "You really should use Rider. It's so much better." I have nothing against the tool at all. I've used Visual Studio so much in my career, and I've actually used it in a way that a lot of people don't. Like, I see so many people that use Visual Studio with the light colorization, the solution explorer that's always pinned, and all these other windows. And I've actually done a lot of time to change it so that the code editor is the only thing I see. I don't even have any toolbars. That's just the only thing that's open. And I've learned the keystrokes to go, oh, if I want to look at the solution explorer, I just do, I think it's like Alt-WS, and then boom, it just pops in. And then if I want to get rid of it, I just go back to the code editor and it goes away. And Visual Studio, I'm not trying to be shill to it in any way, shape, or form. But I've just gotten used to using Visual Studio, and I've noticed over the past 5 years it's gotten better in terms of refactorings and other things that it provides. So, it's just something that at this point I'm just comfortable with. And I don't know, maybe if I gave Rider a whirl, I'd be like, oh, this is kind of cool. I did try to use ReSharper years ago, and I almost threw my computer through the window because I was like, somebody gave me their computer to try for whatever reason. And so I started trying to type something in, and it was completely breaking my flow. It was like adding things as I was typing or was doing other stuff. And I'm like, stop, this is really making me nuts. So my initial impression of that wasn't good, but I know a lot of people swear by these tools. And so I'm like, well, there's obviously got to be something to them. I just haven't taken the time to really. Maybe I should do like a month of Rider, see what happens, see what that's like.
And get you back on the show and see how you found it.
Yeah. Well, I can't say I'm frustrated and I tore my hair out because I don't have any, so I can't use that as an indicator. So.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of ReSharper and Rider, but that's probably one for another episode, and one that I actually do want to have. That's yet another episode. I would love to get one of the JetBrains teams. We had Matt Ellis doing a physical talk at .NET Oxford quite a few years ago about when basically how for Rider they took the ReSharper engine out of process, because everyone that uses ReSharper in Visual Studio knows that it's slow, and it's because at the moment it's in the same process, where for Rider you don't have that same issue.
Yep.
That was a really good talk. But it'd be great to have an episode on Rider as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now I got 3. So,
yeah, we're racking them up. So in your demo, I saw there was this concept of diagnostics. I think you touched on it briefly before, but that seems like from a debugging point of view, as you're developing these, that seems extremely powerful.
Yeah. So the diagnostics are something that have been around in the compiler API before source generators. If you ever wrote an analyzer, that was a way for you to say, hey, I found a condition that I want the user to know about, and I can actually set the diagnostic such that its severity level is error. So that would actually stop the compiler from saying it was a successful compilation. And then if you wrote a code fix, you could say, hey, if this analyzer gives me a diagnostic, I can fix this. I got a way to fix what the problem is, and then do an automatic code fix for the user. So diagnostics have been around for the compiler API before source generators. They just use that as well, so that if I'm writing a source generator and I run into conditions like the object mapping example that I have, I'll use that as my example. There's a couple things that I look for that, if they exist, I got to tell the user, hey, you may want to be aware of this. One of them is if you have 5 properties on one and 4 on the other, well, one's not going to map. Now, that may not be a problem, but there may be something you want to be aware of and go, well, hey, just understand this isn't going to be mapped. So I'll add a diagnostic, but it won't be an error. I think it's either a warning or an informational. Okay. And these diagnostics you can have a message in there and a title, and actually also specify a location to say where in the syntax tree this originated from. So that can also be used by Visual Studio. And then in that case, the user can go, oh, okay, I don't care. That property is not mapped. I don't care. But then what happens if you say I want a source to destination mapping and there's nothing that can be mapped between the two? That's probably something you really want to be aware of. So I create a diagnostic and I make it an error to say, I don't know why you're trying to do a mapping between these two, because nothing maps. So either take away the mapping or make something that maps between the two. And I do this also with the other source generators I've written with rocks and partially applied ones. So yeah, you can use diagnostics as a way to say, I've found my own conditions, I found my own errors, and I want the user to know about these things. So yeah, they're definitely good for error reporting in your source generator.
Nice. We've spoken about generating .NET code. Can you generate other stuff as well, like proto files, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so that actually leads to a potential addition that they're going to maybe add. I can't say for certain. There's actually a PR that I've been made aware of where they're talking about doing this. So right now you can't, and I've tried. at least I couldn't figure out how to actually do this. But I tried to just say, oh, by the way, when I generate C#, I'm also going to generate a text file. That don't work. It doesn't actually. Even if you say like results.txt, it makes it like a CS file anyway. So it doesn't really work the way you want it to. What they're looking at doing is saying, because a lot of people have asked for this, is when I generate my source code, maybe I also want to generate a proto file. Maybe I want to generate a JSON file, or I want to generate any other kind of artifact that comes out of this generation process. Make it available so I can do this in some way. And it looks like they're working on a way to do this with the next version of the source generator API. So yeah, right now I'm not aware of a way to do it, but they're looking at supporting that out of the box in the future. Because yeah, people have asked for this, and there's different reasons why you'd want to do more than just generate C# code.
Yeah, I can see it with all this source generator stuff, library authors like really jumping on these for so many different use cases.
Yeah, there's all looking at what people have done with this already is just amazing. I think I mentioned in the talk for .NET Oxford what somebody did with creating a source generator to find all of your routes in a Blazor application. That was from Andrew Locke. And that one, yeah, it was like I thought of, oh, you could do serializers, you could do, proxy generators, those are types of things. I notify property change. But that idea was interesting because I was like, wow, I just would never have thought of it, but it makes total sense. I could generate a type that has all of my routes in a class, and then I could use that maybe to just build things in my application to automatically have buttons that route to all these things. You could almost think of it as like a Swagger or an open API type of approach for Blazor applications, where I could give the QA team a page that just says, here are all the supported routes, and here are the added values that can go into them if they have them. That was such a cool idea. I really, really like that one. So yeah, there's so many different things that I think source generators can be applied to.
Yeah, it's going to be so interesting looking forward to all the different funky use cases that people come up with.
Yep, I agree totally.
So is this just on .NET 5 onwards, or can you do it with earlier versions?
Yes, it's only for .NET 5 because again, it's part of the compiler. So it wasn't part of the previous compilations. Now you can generate, if you want, you can generate code that isn't C#9 specific if you for whatever reason, if you don't want to do that, that's perfectly fine. There's no restrictions on what version of C# code that you need to generate. But yeah, it only works with the .NET 5 compiler. So that's kind of the restriction there. So you can't do this if you're in .NET Framework or if you're in a previous version of .NET Core.
Cool. So is there anything else we've missed before we move on to dev tips?
Oh, we've covered a lot. I'm looking at the time. I'm like, wow, this has flown by. Yeah, it's so, to me, I'll say this. This is one of these features that have been released in C# that I really am happy that they did. Even with some of the warts and some of the shortcomings that it has, it still, the power and the flexibility it gives people is tremendous. And if people would ask me, what are some of your favorite features of C#? I can't think of writing C# code without generics. It was such a huge addition, and people just take it for granted now in a way. Things with LINQ, even if you don't use LINQ, just the fact that we have type inference, small thing, but that's what I do all the time is var. And there are other features like that. This is one of them. And not that it's not like a feature like generics. If you make a list of string, lots of .NET developers use that. Source generators aren't necessarily going to be written by every C# developer out there, but they can be used by some people to build projects or NuGet packages that lots of other people can use to make their lives easier. So yeah, it's a great feature, and I hope that people spend some time to at least take a look at it and start thinking about where could I potentially use this.
Yeah, definitely. I think my favorite C#9 feature is got to be record types.
Yeah, it's a nice that's a nice one too. There's lots of things in C#9 that were added that we're kind of like, oh, that's pretty cool. Records being one of them, but I have my bias.
Well, if we get started with record types, we'll be here for another half an hour or another hour. Definitely one of my favorite features. So shall we do dev tips?
Sure, we can do that. So I've got two of them I can give you, and I need to go look at my notes because I wrote these down and I didn't want to forget them. Okay, here they are. All right, so my two code tips I have, one of them is really small, and it actually was added in C#9, which is not null. So for many years, for however long C#'s been around, if you wanted to check for null, everybody would do is my object equal null. And for the vast majority of cases that were not equal, the exclamation point equal, so not equal. That works in the vast majority of cases. But there can always be some jerk out there that can override what those operators do, and the semantics aren't then what you expect. They're not going to work the way you think they do. Again, that's somebody who's being malicious. You never really want to do that. But those operators are not literally checking for what you want it to do. So in C#9, you now have the ability to say, is my object is not null? And you can do that comparison in a way that it's literally going to check to see, is it equal to null or not in the IL. So it's a small thing, but I'm changing all my code and my habit right now to do that. So I would encourage people to do that as well. The other one is recommending people as a dev tip to use a library called benchmark.net. I don't know how many times I tell people about this tool, this package, and if I've done this in a talk where I'm actually in the crowd and I can see people raising their hands, I'm like, how many people have used benchmark.net? And it's still to this day, I won't see a lot of people raising their hands. And I'm like, please use this tool, especially if you're ever trying to just do a thing where you're comparing a couple of different implementations to see which one's better. Don't write your own stopwatch, start, stop, or daytime now, or any of this stuff, and hope that your results are what you're thinking are. Because benchmarking is complicated. To do it right, it's really hard. And that package makes it so much simpler. So that's one I wish people would use more often, because you can easily set up a class with 2 or 3 different implementations. Tell the runner, go off, go get a cup of coffee or a beer, whatever what time of the day it is for you, because it is going to take some time to not only find out which one's faster, but if you use memory diagnosers, it will also tell you how much memory it's allocated. And you can target different CLR versions. There's so many things that this tool can do. So that's one I would definitely encourage people in .NET to take a look at, is benchmark.net.
It's funny with the is not null point. I was listening to one of your adventures in .NET that you were recently on their podcast, and I can include a link in the show notes. And I think that was all about C#9. And you mentioned this. And then yesterday, when I was doing some code, I changed a few of them to is not null because of your episode.
Well, that's good. Okay, well that's good to hear, and hopefully people hear this one and they didn't pick up that you can do that in C#9 now, that they can start changing those things in their code. And again, it's probably not going to suddenly break anything, but it's the right way to test for null. So,
and it's English as well. It's kind of, I've seen over Twitter some funky ways people are using all these different new syntaxes in C#9 with the English words, like with, and then it is not null, and then combining them to make really weird looking code.
If there's one person to follow, it's Jared Parsons. He's on the C# team, and he sometimes will find out, he'll tweet about things that you read it and it's technically correct C# code, and you're like, why are you doing this? This is evil. This is horrible. Like he showed the trick where you can actually define a public static class called var. And and that's correct, because var wasn't a keyword until C#3. So it's possible somebody could have defined a type called var, and they have to honor that for backward compatibility. So if you really don't like var, just add a public static class in no namespace, so it's in the global namespace, and have it called var. And no matter what editor config or anything you do, it's going to say, oh, you really are trying to create or type something as var. And just makes everything go haywire. It's fun.
Please don't say that to our listeners, because I like var. I don't want that being put in code bases. Don't do that.
Don't do that. That's like you said, some of the things that you can do now, the wordings and stuff. There's quite interesting things you can come up with in C# that look funky, but they're actually correct. So
Jared actually wrote the VS Vim extension for Visual Studio.
Yep.
Which I've used very, very heavily. Speaking of benchmark.net, and also we were talking about record types before, I saw a tweet yesterday and someone had tweeted that they'd used benchmark and they'd found that record types doubled the speed of JSON serialization. And I could not work out why that would be the case.
Well, I think the person said, because I replied to him or her, I'm sorry, I'm not sure who it actually was, but it was somebody that said that, yeah, that they had looked at records, and it was, if they used records rather than their own types, it made the serialization in JSON twice as fast or something like that. But there wasn't a link to a GIST that had something with benchmark.net in it or anything. It was just a claim. And either I missed where the details were or it wasn't provided. So I kind of followed up and said, hey, do you got a repo or something to take a look at? Because I'd be really interested in seeing what was set up to do it. But yeah, that was quite the interesting claim, because records are just classes underneath the scenes right now. There's, they're thinking about maybe allowing you to say structs as record types in C# 10, but right now records automatically are classes. So I'm like, how would that be any faster? So yeah, that's something. I'm glad you reminded me about that, because I want to keep pushing that person. I want to see the details.
I replied as well, asking if he knew why that was the case, because I didn't understand why. Yeah, I wonder if he was comparing an older version of .NET using classes with a new project using record types, maybe.
It could be. That's one of those things that's why I wanted to. So I'm looking at the tweet right now. Oh, that was David McCarter. That's the person that said it. But yeah, I don't think, I'm looking at the thread right now on Twitter, I don't know if he ever actually put any results out there. Oh, somebody did a benchmark run themselves and did it. Oh, okay, good. David did reply. So he did have a repository out there that shows what he did, although I don't know if that's benchmark. Anyway, yeah, that's one of the things too with benchmark.net is not only is it good for you to discover what may be faster or not, but it also is a very easy way for you to put these tests together, publish the results, and then put them somewhere, and then somebody else can run it on their machine or take a look at it and go, well, the way you set up your test is subtly influencing the results in a way you didn't really see right away. So maybe that's the case. I don't know. But yeah, that was weird. I didn't see how records could suddenly make things that much faster. Anyway, another thing to look at today. Thank you, Dan.
So that's the rest of your day gone. It's actually like quite early in the morning for you over there, isn't it?
It's 9:30 right now, so not that early. So I got time. Time today.
So my dev tip is, if you're recording a podcast, press record.
I wasn't going to say anything because when we started this, Dan forgot to press the button, and he said I could take. What was the mic? I'm sorry, that's like a phrase that you probably say. In America, I've heard of it. What is the phrase?
Oh, you should say take the mic. Yeah, that's right. Okay,
but yeah, you didn't press the record, but fortunately we noticed, or you noticed it only like 5 minutes in, so we didn't have to do the whole thing over. But yeah, that's a great tip. Sure,
I must remember that in future.
Put a big Post-it note on your screen, record. So
my real dev tip is to use ID bookmarks, because I don't actually see many people use this when coding. And when I'm working in a code base, I find that dropping temporary bookmarks in key parts of code whilst I'm working on a feature makes it super quick to jump around different areas of code that feature requires. And it saves me an awful lot of time and a lot of cognitive load trying to remember where all the different bits are, especially in a new code base that I'm not that familiar with. But I just never see anyone using bookmarks, so I thought it was worth pointing that one out.
What's a bookmark?
Have you got Visual Studio open?
Yep, I do.
Now, this might be a resharper thing, so we're about to find out. If you do Control KK, has that put a bookmark? No,
it doesn't do anything. Control K.
Oh, maybe it's a resharper thing. I'm sure Visual Studio must have bookmarks.
I'm doing the Control Q, look up bookmarks.
KK does it on mine because I use Rider and I've recently upgraded my computer, so I've not yet installed Resharper in Visual Studio, and I've got it open now. And if I do Control KK in the gutter, there's like a bookmark thing, and you can then do, I think, Control KN and jump around your bookmarks, and it just makes it really quick to jump around. But maybe your keyboard shortcuts, you've got a different schema.
Yeah, that might be it. I know sometimes the things that I do on my keyboard shortcuts, for whatever reason, it may be because I used an old key mapping from a while ago, and That's just what it just keeps going forward of every new version of Visual Studio I have, so they don't necessarily map. But I'm using the search Control Q to do like toggle book. Oh, that works. Toggle bookmark. Okay. So then I get a little flag here. That's a breakpoint. But now I don't know what to do with the bookmark.
Well, there's a pane called bookmarks. If you go to like View, Windows, or in fact your Control key when you do the search, and then you can actually rename the bookmarks as well to give them meaningful names. So I just found that really useful for just. I don't have bookmarks I keep long term. I generally create them as I'm working on a feature or something, and then I would delete them when I finished, and it just means I can quickly jump around.
So is this kind of like when you dog ear a book in a way? So that oh, that was an important section in the book, and then you can like, I don't know if that's an American phrase or not, but where you can basically
where you fold the page down. Yeah, kind of. It's the bookmarks against a line of code rather than the whole file. So you can like put a bookmark next to a function that you're currently working on, and then, for example, say you're working on a feature where you've got the front end project in React or whatever it is in the same instance of Rider or Visual Studio. You've also got like a backend project with like a controller and then some business logic. You can just pop breakpoints down in those different places and jump around.
Cool.
And I just find it gets rid of a lot of cognitive load just remembering where all the things were.
Because I've noticed people will sometimes just do like comments with to do, and that might have the kind of the similar feel, but this is a little bit more structured way it feels like to do it. So, cool.
Cool. So before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Other than kind of what I said before, which is if you haven't taken a look at source generators, take the time to at least play with them if you can, because they can potentially make your life easier in the long run. So that's the thing I want to get across in this podcast.
And I'll definitely include a link to your .NET Oxford talk in the show notes, because obviously this is audio only, so that will let you see some actual code. So a big thank you, Jason, for joining us. It's been amazing having you on.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Cool. And thank you, everyone, for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please do help me spread the word. I normally use the hashtag #unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter @Dracan, DRACAN, and my DMs are open. And remember that mentions might get read out on the show too. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And all the things we've mentioned in today's episode will be included in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.